Hi everyone, thank you in advance for listening to this talk, which I'm calling The Whiteness of Weather, Affect, Indigeneity, and Comedy in Jenny Ophil's novel. U.S. author Jenny Ophil's novel Weather came out in February 2020, and I read it ostensibly for fun over one weekend, only to find myself awash in what I would call a vague or ambient sense of dread. When I put the book down, I realized it's not just the deadly pandemic that is sweeping the planet right now, it's actually specifically this book that's making me feel terrible. I remembered almost nothing about the novel afterward except for that feeling, not even the protagonist's name. Today I want to think through that vagueness of Ophil's novel, establishing its particularly white affect. And then I'll read it vis-a-vis contemporary Indigenous theorizing and a tiny bit vis-a-vis Black feminist comedy to further understand this whiteness. So I'm definitely expecting this talk to be a companion to Sarah Osmond's talk on this panel, which will also take up whiteness. Before I go any further, I want to establish that the novel has been received by many scholars as a work of climate fiction or cli-fi, though not all readers would see it that way. It does not feature spectacular future events such as storms or floods, like we see in recent well-known U.S. cli-fi novels such as Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow or Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. But we do wade through the narrator's anxieties about, among many other things, quote-unquote, climate departure, which seems to be a kind of synonym for climate migration. And I think it's actually really important that Ophil uses that specific phrase, but I'll get there. And here's an example wherein the narrator and her husband are fantasizing about what she refers to as doomsteads, which are basically post-apocalyptic refuges. I'm reading from the slide here. Quote, Ben and I make a list of requirements for our doomstead: arable land, a water source, access to a train line, high on a hill. Are we on a hill for floods or defense? Both. I'll build a moat, he says, then goes on the internet to learn how to do it, end quote. So keep the climate departure stuff in the back of your head, but for now, some basic observations about Weather's form and style. First off, the novel is narrated in first person, primarily in simple present tense. Most of what we know about the narrator, or really anything within the story world at all, is either obliquely referenced, belatedly revealed, or just inferred, which is part of what produces this sense of vagueness I was talking about. So while I can summarize that she is a white, liberal, middle-aged librarian in the US named Lizzie who is married with a young son, that picture emerges quite slowly and fuzzily when you actually read the novel. Second, there is no main plot to speak of in Weather, just a few hints of plot that basically fizzle out, including the lead up to a presidential election in the United States that is clearly inspired by that of Donald Trump. Relatedly, the novel proceeds as fragments, episodes or vignettes, interspersed with ellipses and interrupted by quotations from sources ranging from magazine articles to questions submitted for Lizzie's mentor's Doomsday podcast, Hell or High Water, as well as quotations unattributed to any source at all. And right now I'm showing a slide of a random page from the novel that exemplifies those things I was just describing. Finally, the novel is vague not just on the macro levels of characterization or plot, but also on the micro levels of word choice, referent, syntax, and grammar. Early in the novel, for example, Ophil gives us this isolated, ominous fragment, and I'm reading from the slide here. Quote, I look out the window, something in the distance, limping toward the trees, end quote. We're missing active verbs in the second sentence there. Not, I see something in the distance, and not, something in the distance is limping. And in fact, words like something and someone, everything and everyone recur throughout the novel, sometimes with half a dozen or so or more uses on a single page. So who cares? Surely Ophil is certainly not the first author to withhold information or play with narrative fragmentation or anything else I just mentioned. And she's also certainly not the first author to thematize climate change. But I think Weather is a unique, if not singular, site at which to think through what geographer Andrew Baldwin calls white affect in the article Pre-Mediation and White Affect, Climate Change and Migration in Critical Perspective. And I'm going to proceed with this idea of white affect at face value for now. So basically as a reference to white people and emotion. I claim that Weather's form and style both exemplify and invoke white affect vis-a-vis climate change. The whiteness of Weather's affect lies primarily, I think, in the generalized nature of the protagonist's anxiety. So she seems to be worried about everything and nothing all at once, and in its, by definition, anticipatory nature. So where will we live later, as opposed to where will we live now? The protagonist's white and Western privilege means that she has never really had to worry about much of anything before, say, 2016, when Trump came to power. And what she worries about now, in her present tense narration, are things that have still not yet come to pass. Many of you will recall how white Americans around this moment in real life had to be reminded that the things they feared would happen to them, such as the stripping of reproductive rights or freedom of speech, had already happened to people of color. On that same note, I should mention that a lot of Indigenous scholars have taken issue with the idea of climate change as an unprecedented catastrophe or existential threat, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with this claim, but I'll get to that a little bit later. This all connects, in my mind, to Sarah Jaquette Ray's idea of climate anxiety as an overwhelmingly white phenomenon. Ray hypothesizes that, quote, climate anxiety may just be code for white people wishing to hold on to their way of life or get back to normal, to the comforts of their privilege, end quote. But perhaps most concerning are the ways in which climate anxiety can slide and has slid into ecofascism and xenophobia, as the most anxious start to, and this is directly from Ray again, hoard resources, limit the rights of the most affected, and seek to save only their own, end quote. We might therefore distinguish between something like climate anxiety and something like climate grief, the difference between the latter two being a matter of privilege. So now I want to start thinking about the whiteness of weather in terms of its engagement, or rather lack of engagement, with indigeneity. And I'll be building here on my recent work with my former student, Brigitte Perot. So basically, Brigitte and I read and viewed several works of Cli-Fi for an independent study, including Odds Against Tomorrow and New York 2140, which I mentioned earlier, and you can see the covers of those here. And we found not only that mainstream Cli-Fi tends to center white men as heroes, but more specifically that it tends to invoke indigenous peoples only to absent and sometimes even appropriate their experiences and traditions. So Odds refers to how the Lenape people used to canoe through what is currently downtown Manhattan, and then later the white protagonist ends up canoeing through downtown Manhattan after massive flooding. These works thereby advance the old vanishing Indian myth, which holds that indigenous peoples have long since died out, to put it blandly, contributing to what Anishinaabe artist Lisa Jackson calls the tendency to stereotype everything indigenous as stuck in the past and incapable of moving into our present or our future. These tendencies contribute to a larger status quo wherein, to quote Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White, concepts and narratives of crises, dystopia, and apocalypse obscure and erase past and ongoing oppression against indigenous peoples and other groups, end quote. And they align with what Indigenous Studies scholar April Anson has referred to as settler apocalypticism, whereby, quote, the state of emergency story serves the settler state's white claims to land, end quote. So in Odds Against Tomorrow, the flooding of New York leads the protagonist to make a new life in New Orleans, from which indigenous people and more recently Black people have been forced out. We therefore argue that, intentionally or not, mainstream Cli-Fi functions to justify settler colonialism and the white mobility inherent to it. So it's a big sort of summary of that previous work. Like those other texts, Weather references indigeneity enough times to be notable. So there's at least 6 references in what is a very short novel, while never referencing any actual living indigenous people. So it does that same invocation / erasure thing. But it's very slippery when it comes to its own self-awareness. One of the passages in question reads, quote, First conference with Sylvia. One thing I'll say about it, lots of people who are not Native Americans talking about Native Americans, end quote. On the one hand, the narrator and the novel seem woke, quote unquote, about indigenous absence or erasure, right? But on the other hand, the lots of people who are not Native Americans talking about Native Americans includes Ophil's narrator and extra-textually, of course, Ophil herself, as well as me, by the way. So depending on how you read this, the novel's self-consciousness either enacts erasure, critiques erasure, or erases the erasure, if that makes sense. And I'm actually still thinking through this. But I think that this next moment from the novel is even more interesting. The narrator is helping her young son with his homework, and then I'm reading a long quotation here from a slide, and notices a prompt at the bottom. And this is a classic kind of thing from the novel where she doesn't say the bottom of what, but we can sort of infer from the past in the novel that it's a page of a textbook. So she notices, quote, a prompt at the bottom reminding him to answer the question in a complete sentence. We make our houses out of wood or bricks. The Eskimo makes his house out of snow. Can his snow house keep him warm? Isn't it Inuit, I say? Eskimo is an old word, I think. Later, I go looking through my books to see if I can find what I'm remembering. And then, just when I'm about to give up, there it is in a box of old papers. I wrote half a dissertation once. The Domestication of Death, cross-cultural mythologies, I was pleased to call it, end quote. Here, the narrator's apparent concern over outdatedness ironically manages to relegate Indigenous peoples to the past. After all, the son's textbook or homework assignment uses present tense with Eskimo, whereas Inuit, the supposedly new word, exists in the novel only as part of a box of old papers. Now again, we could say that Ophil, if not her narrator, is fully self-aware. The line, I was pleased to call it, clearly casts her narrator as a smug, self-centered white liberal of whom we could all be critical. And speaking of self-centered, I'm kind of obsessed with the use of I's here. So I've highlighted this on the next slide so that sentence isn't it Inuit, I say. The first four words begin with the letter I, and then we have these references to the narrator over and over again. I say, I think, I can, I'm remembering, I wrote, I was pleased. So there's definitely something going on there with how we're supposed to think about her in terms of self-centeredness. But the narrator and the novel itself get to have it both ways, and I think that's what I find most insidious. At the end of the day, Weather lacks what Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon calls vibrant Indigenous presence, and yet it gets to look like it's critiquing that lack. But again, so what? I'm not quite sure yet if Weather and its white climate function to justify settler colonialism in the same ways as those other texts I referenced. What I can say is that it's much more instructive than those texts. For one thing, it allows us to see that Cli-Fi's obsession with the vanishing Indian may not be about Indigenous people per se, and maybe not even about white people, but about the emotional structures of anxiety and fear that shape whiteness in the first place. And here we have to go back to Baldwin, and I have to admit that his notion of white affect is much more complicated than I originally let on. He's writing specifically about discourses in the global north about climate change and migration. So fears in, say, London about people flooding in from Africa or Asia. And he tells us that, quote, this is the next slide, the affect animating the discourse is not just some generic fear of the other, nor even just a fear of the racial other, but a desire to preserve the apparent normalcy of an imagined social order that the monstrous future conditional climate change migrant threatens to overwhelm, end quote. More specifically, he argues that white affect is a kind of intensity that arises when white positionality is backformed against a sense of white loss and the impending impotence of whiteness. And in that last phrase, he's quoting David Theo Goldberg. This white persecution, white victimhood, white extinction, white replacement narrative is, of course, all over the US and in various formulations of white supremacy worldwide right now. And Baldwin is very insistent that white affect is less about skin color per se than, quote, an epistemological orientation, a framework of meaning, or a habit of perception, end quote. And this is really important when we think about, for example, the presence of people of color in white supremacist movements such as the Proud Boys. But Back to weather. When I was first reading this article, I thought that Baldwin's sense of white affect doesn't really apply to weather because the narrator is talking about herself and her family moving to another state or country because of climate change, not other people moving into wherever she is. But it clicked when I realized that she uses the phrase climate departure rather than climate migration or climate refugees to talk about this process. Ophil's narrator cannot be a climate migrant or climate refugee because she is white. Or, as Baldwin would have it, she is white because she is not a climate migrant or climate refugee. Settler colonialism does not allow this effective conceptual formulation, given that it is premised on the white right of mobility. And I think there's also something there about how the narrator narrates her life in present tense, given that Baldwin says the climate migrant or refugee is always future conditional. Stylistically speaking, she cannot be a climate migrant or climate refugee. And I'm still working that point out, but I think that's right. So if Baldwin is correct that white affect is not something produced by white people as much as it produces white people, then perhaps we can say that in their capacity to not only reference, but also enact affective responses, Cli-Fi works such as Weather contribute to what he calls the rescripting of race at this current moment. And I'm basically out of time here, but I'm just going to throw something out here really quickly and see if anyone wants to talk about it in Q&A, because it's something I'm still really interested in, but just have not developed yet. And it's that there's at least one other, probably many more, but there's at least one other way of thinking about weather's whiteness, and that's through comedy. So the novel regularly makes jokes, but also quotes jokes. So in a future project, I want to read Weather against U.S. comedian Sarah Cooper's Netflix comedy special, Everything's Fine, which is a morning talk show parody that also features a weather report. And there's all sorts of things in the special about how that Sarah Cooper, this slide here is showing Sarah Cooper becoming famous through her TikToks, lip-syncing Donald Trump, and in this case talking about climate change. But so the special is sort of about Black women and minoritized subjects not being able to express things like climate anxiety, or, to show any kind of anger whatsoever without being called, hysterical or aggressive or something like that. But again, don't have time to get into this, but the point here is that both Weather and Everything's Fine ask important questions about the pertinence and efficacy of comedy in a time of climate crisis. But only one of these two texts uses comedy to consider which humans can express climate and other emotions, and to consider experiences of crisis that lie in the past and present, and not just the future. Thank you very much.